This wasn't about right and wrong. It was about money. 4,000 years ago, before banks existed, before anyone traded stocks, before people even had a word for the economy, one ruler figured out something most of us still don't get. Civilizations don't fall apart because people are bad. They fall apart because the money rules break down. And when money rules break, violence follows. Welcome to the Financial Historian, where money, power, and history crash into each other. And nothing is ever as simple as it seems. When you hear the name Hammurabi, you probably think of revenge. An eye for an eye. A brutal ancient world where justice was harsh and carved into stone, where mercy didn't exist. That story is easy to remember. It's simple, and it's almost completely wrong. Because if you actually read what Hammurabi wrote on that famous stone around 1754 BC, you realize something uncomfortable. His code isn't about morality, it's about money. Out of nearly 300 laws, most have nothing to do with murder or violence. They're about loans, wages, contracts, interest rates. What happens when you can't pay someone back? Who's responsible when something goes wrong? In other words, the things that quietly decide who survives and who doesn't when a society grows beyond a small village. Babylon wasn't some philosophical experiment. It was a business hub. It sat between major trade routes. Grain, silver, livestock, land, and labor moved through it constantly. Farmers borrowed against crops they hadn't grown yet. Merchants financed trips across dangerous territory. Builders got paid to construct homes. Everything ran on trust, and trust without rules doesn't work when thousands of people are involved. Without clear rules, every bad harvest becomes a personal disaster. Every unpaid loan becomes a family feud. Every collapsed building becomes an excuse for violence. Hammurabi didn't walk into a peaceful society and decide to add some rules. He walked into an unstable economy and decided to stabilize it. Here's what most people miss. The code wasn't trying to make people good. It was trying to make outcomes predictable. Because unpredictability kills economies. When nobody knows who's responsible, when things go wrong, trade stops, credit dries up. People resort to force. Hammurabi understood that the fastest way to stop chaos wasn't to lecture people about being better. It was to define exactly who pays when disaster strikes. The moment you define who's responsible, behavior changes. You create incentives. You create a system. Debt was his first major problem. In ancient Mesopotamia, debt wasn't some abstract number on a screen. It was personal and immediate. If a farmer borrowed grain and the harvest failed, he didn't just default on paperwork. His land could be taken. His children could become servants to pay off the debt. His entire family could disappear into bondage over one bad season. Left unchecked, this kind of debt spiral didn't just destroy families. It destroyed the tax base. It destabilized food production. It created unrest. A society that drowns its own farmers in permanent debt doesn't survive long. So the code imposed limits, not out of kindness, but out of necessity. Interest rates were kept. Debt servitude was limited to a few years instead of forever. In some cases, debts were suspended after natural disasters. These weren't acts of mercy. They were acts of risk management. Dead or enslaved farmers don't grow food. And a king without food doesn't stay king for long. Hammurabi wasn't protecting the poor. He was protecting the system that fed the empire. Then came contracts. Hammurabi's laws didn't care about your intentions. They cared about results. If a builder constructed a house and it collapsed, killing the owner, the builder paid the price. If a merchant lost goods someone trusted him with, he was liable. If an agent failed to deliver, the responsibility didn't vanish into excuses. This wasn't cruelty. It was clarity. When responsibility is clear, people calculate risk correctly. Builders build better. Merchants buy insurance. Trade becomes safer, not because people are kinder, but because the consequences are known in advance. This is the quiet genius of the code. It didn't try to eliminate failure. It assigned it. Someone always paid. And once people knew who that someone would be, their behavior changed. The idea that risk has to land somewhere, that losses don't just vanish because circumstances are unfortunate, this is one of the oldest financial principles on earth. Long before insurance companies, before corporations, before modern contract law, Hammurabi understood something economists now call moral hazard. If people aren't held responsible for outcomes, they take reckless risks, and reckless risk, multiplied across a society, becomes collapse. Wages and prices work the same way. The code laid out fixed payments for specific jobs. Ox drivers earned this much. Surgeons earned that much. Builders, shepherds, craftsmen, their compensation was standardized, not because it was fair, but because it reduced conflict. Every negotiation creates friction. Every dispute is a potential breakdown. Hammurabi's system removed that uncertainty. You knew what your work was worth before you started. You knew what you'd be paid if things went well, and what would happen if they didn't. Markets don't need kindness. They need consistency. Hammurabi wasn't trying to make everyone happy. He was trying to keep commerce moving. Consistency is what makes trade possible. It lowers costs. It prevents endless arguing. It stops disagreements from turning violent. In a world without courts or appeals or regulators, these rules were the infrastructure of trust. But there's one more thing embedded in the code, and it's where that romantic image of ancient justice really falls apart. The rules were not equal. The penalty for the same offense changed depending on your social class. Injury to a noble carried a different consequence than the same injury to a commoner. Financial responsibility flowed differently depending on your status. Power was written directly into the law. This wasn't hypocrisy. It was by design. Elites were protected because they held land, capital, and political stability. Lower classes absorbed more risk because the system depended on it. This wasn't about fairness, it was about keeping the hierarchy intact, and that too is a financial rule as old as civilization itself. Systems don't just manage money. They decide who absorbs losses when things go wrong. Hammurabi made that decision explicit. The stone didn't hide it, it announced it. By the time the code was carved and placed where everyone could see it, Babylon had already learned a lesson that modern societies still struggle to accept. You don't control debt with good morals. You don't stabilize trade with good intentions. And you don't prevent collapse by hoping people will behave better. You do it by writing rules that make outcomes predictable, losses clear, and power visible. Because once money enters the picture, morality alone isn't enough. And Hammurabi knew it. Here's the part most people hate hearing. Hammurabi's system worked not because it was fair, not because it was kind, but because it accepted something most societies prefer to deny, that every economic system is built around deciding who absorbs the damage when reality breaks the plan. The code didn't pretend losses could be eliminated. It didn't promise prosperity for everyone. It did something far more dangerous and far more effective. It made loss predictable. And once loss is predictable, power can plan around it. That's why the code wasn't equal. Different classes faced different consequences for the same action because equality wasn't the goal. Stability was. If an elite man injured another elite, the punishment was physical and severe. An eye for an eye when it came to equals. If he injured a commoner, the penalty was paid in silver. If he injured a slave, compensation went to the owner, because the law treated the loss not as human suffering, but as damaged property. The same logic ran through everything. A surgeon who killed a noble lost his hands. If the patient was a slave, he simply replaced the asset. A builder was executed if a house collapse killed its owner, but paid compensation if it killed a slave. Elites held land, capital, and political authority. Protecting them wasn't corruption. It was damage control. If a wealthy landowner collapsed, the shock rippled outward through tenants, workers, taxes, and food supply. If a laborer collapsed, The system barely noticed. That wasn't moral reasoning. It was cold math. And it's the same math that still governs modern financial systems, no matter how politely we dress it up. This is where ancient history starts to feel uncomfortably modern. Because what Hammurabi carved into stone, we now write into policy. Bankruptcy laws don't exist to reward failure. They exist to control it, to make sure collapse doesn't spread uncontrollably. Debt relief isn't about generosity. It's about preventing mass defaults from tearing apart the system that created the debt in the first place. Central banks don't step in during crises because they love free markets. They step in because unmanaged collapse is worse. 4,000 years separate Babylon from today, but the logic hasn't changed. When debt threatens the system, rules bend. When instability spreads upward, intervention appears. When instability stays trapped at the bottom, it's often ignored. That's not ideology. That's structural design. Hammurabi didn't invent this pattern, he just formalized it. Think about inflation for a moment. Inflation isn't just rising prices. It's a quiet shift of who bears the loss. It erodes savings. It lightens the real weight of debt. It moves pain away from borrowers and onto people holding currency. That mechanism didn't appear with modern money. It's the same logic Hammurabi applied when he capped interest and suspended debts after disasters. You don't let the financial system devour the producers it depends on. You reshape the rules so the damage spreads instead of concentrates. And here's the real irony. Modern societies talk endlessly about free markets, fairness, and opportunity. Ancient Babylon was more honest. The code didn't pretend everyone played by the same rules. It told you exactly where you stood. It told you who paid when things went wrong. It didn't sell the illusion that morality governed money. It admitted that money governed morality. That honesty is what made the system last. Predictability creates participation. Participation creates growth. Growth creates power. Hammurabi understood that if people believed the rules were stable, even if they were harsh, they would keep producing, trading, and lending. Chaos doesn't come from inequality alone. It comes from uncertainty, from not knowing whether tomorrow's loss will destroy you completely or be absorbed by the system. Modern finance still runs on this principle. The difference is that today, the rules are buried in legal language, regulatory frameworks, and balance sheets most people never read. In Babylon, the rules were carved in stone and placed where everyone could see them. There was no illusion. There was no myth of fairness, just structure. This is why so many people feel lost in the modern financial system. They sense that something isn't right, but they're looking in the wrong place. The system was never designed to be moral. It was designed to survive. And survival requires sacrifice. Someone always pays. The only real question is who, and whether the rules make that answer visible or hide it behind complexity. Hammurabi didn't promise freedom, he promised order. And in doing so, he revealed something most people still refuse to understand. Financial freedom doesn't come from believing the system is just. It comes from understanding how the system actually works, from knowing where risk flows, from recognizing which rules bend under pressure and which ones don't. This is the real legacy of the Code of Hammurabi. Not vengeance, not cruelty, but the realization that once money enters a society, power must choose between chaos and control. And control always comes with rules that protect the system before they protect individuals. The first civilization learned this lesson the hard way. Every civilization since has learned it again, usually during a crisis. History doesn't repeat, it refines. The tools change, the language evolves, but the structure remains. Debt still binds, rules still decide outcomes. Power still manages collapse before it manages justice. Those who understand this aren't shocked when systems bend to save themselves. They expect it. Because the oldest financial rule on earth was never about right or wrong. It was about survival. And 4,000 years later, we're still playing by it. If this changed how you see things, hit subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.